This is part 2 of the McClung Museum's Civil War lecture series. My name is Joan Markel, and I am the Civil War Curator at the McClung Museum. This is the second part of the lecture on Sherman, which is the fourth of the 4 lectures that were to be given this spring at the McClung Museum. The series has been going on for 10 years, and so this year the focus was on generals in Knoxville that had made a difference. The first one in the series this year was General Simon Bolivar Buckner, Confederate. Second was Ambrose Burnside, Union. Third was James Longstreet, Confederate, and the fourth one was William Sherman, who was a Union officer. Today we're going to finish the Sherman lecture by looking at the important role that some Knoxville connections made in the course of the war from March of '64 through April of '65. The review of part 1, well, that was Sherman's early life, Sherman's larger career, Sherman's experience with East Tennessee, and why some of the decisions he made were so important for East Tennessee. But let's look at how his meeting with 2 other individuals here in Knoxville made a difference in how the war was documented and how that documentation came through time to us here. First of all, look at a man whose name was George Norman Barnard. It is true, and much more readily available now is the information that no, Matthew Brady did not take every single picture of the Civil War. People worked for him. George Norman Barnard, for a time, worked for Brady, but the period I'm interested in for this man was in Tennessee, in working out in Nashville, and the work that he did here in Knoxville. This is one of those beautiful maps that was created. The date is November 13th, 1863. The original of this map is in College Park, Maryland. And sorry about that. All right. This beautiful, huge map, the original is in College Park, Maryland, but a digital copy of it is available at NOAA, the weather people. Historical charts and graphs looking for Knoxville, Tennessee will give you this downloadable image of not all of Knox County. But the interesting thing about this is it predates the Battle of Campbell Station. It predates certainly the siege of Knoxville, the Battle at Fort Sanders. It is a beautiful, detailed, intelligent map. It says from reconnaissances made on the direction of Captain O.M. Poe and other reliable sources. This is the detail of information that General Burnside had available to him. And one of the fascinating things for historians and genealogists is all along the main roads, and this is Kingston Pike, are houses and names so that you can tell exactly who lived there, where they lived on the road. One of the ones I find fascinating is there is an annotation for Widow Baker. This is at the Baker Peters house. In June of '63, Dr. Baker was killed by Union cavalry, and therefore by November of '63, when this map was made, his wife was Widow Baker, living at the same house. In any case, all around Knox County, all of the major roads have designations as to distance from Knoxville, family names, few churches. There's seminary out in Clinton, and the schoolhouse, Sam Houston Schoolhouse, is annotated. This is an extremely detailed map, and this was the kind of information that was provided by the work of Orlando Poe. Now, interestingly too, this is the actual version that's at National Archives. If you look at this one again, you can see bottom right, it's truncated. The original map has this handwritten design inscription, photographed at the office of the Chief Engineer, Military District of Tennessee. This is actually Orlando Poe's office. And photographing that kind of a huge map, you can imagine what kind of work it would take to hand copy a map like this. There were a couple of other techniques possibly that could be used. And of course, the Coast Survey was doing amazing work now by this time with mapping. But it's still a problem out in the field to get a copy. Well, photographed, photocopy, this is what they were doing in Nashville. And it's at this area of where the work is being done, this is where George Barnard is being employed by the Army. It's a great way to increase knowledge, replicate a map that is very complicated, and it's something that is being done in the Western Theater. And this person doing it is George Barnard, and the original office is in Nashville, which is where Orlando Poe goes after he's here in Knoxville. This is George Barnard. On the left is a portrait by Matthew Brady. You can see why Brady was the great one when it came to portraiture. He really did a good job making people look good. Barnard himself did some portrait photography, but he is going to make his name during the war with his photographs of outside photographs of fortifications and battle sites and some people. And he is, in fact, a civilian, and he's working for the U.S. Army. Excuse me. In March of '64, Poe and Barnard visit Knoxville. The battle at Fort Sanders took place November 29, 1863. The U.S. Army is now in control. It held against the Confederate attack of James Longstreet, was relieved by Sherman coming up to Knoxville and right after the battle, early December '63. And now Longstreet has left Knoxville, gone up the railroad line because he doesn't have any maps. He's got to follow the railroad line up to Russellville where he winters. But Poe and Barnard come back in March of '64. Poe's diary, which is at Library of Congress, states that he is on the train. He's coming up to get from Nashville to Knoxville. At this time, you have to go to Chattanooga. There is no train over the plateau. So he starts out in Nashville. He goes down to Chattanooga. Then the train from Chattanooga comes to Knoxville. And on the train, he meets Sue Boyd. This is the young lady who lives at Blunt Mansion. She was, even at this time, she was famous as a singer. When she gets back to town, she's mentioned in the diary of Ellen Renshaw House, that she says that Sue Boyd went north to do her shopping, which is an interesting event in the middle of a war. At any rate, Sue talks to Poe and asks for photographs of Poe and Sanders. Sue was in love with Sanders, William P. Sanders, who was killed November 19th, 1863, just before the battle. And so she asks Poe for photographs, and he says in his diary that he will provide those for her. Anyway, the train trip from Chattanooga, he describes it happens in a snowstorm, and it's 13 hours it takes to get from Chattanooga to Knoxville. When he gets here, he says he stays with Mr. Hoxie, and this Mr. Hoxie, James Hoxie, name comes up in many different accounts of the battle, of the fortifications, of the defenses, because he was the manager of the railroad yard, and he was the one who had the excess telegraph wire that was used as an entanglement in front of Fort Sanders to trip up the assaulting troops. Some accounts say that it was Hoxie's idea to do the entanglements. Some say he simply offered the telegraph wire to Orlando Poe, and Poe came up with the idea. Others say that there was a artillerist, Benjamin, inside the fort, and that Benjamin might have gotten this idea from Vicksburg. I'm still looking for solid documentation as to which of these accounts is actually true, but what happened was the telegraph wire that was in excess materials in the railroad yard was used by the Union, by the engineer Orlando Poe, to create one of the very first dirty tricks of the war by stretching this wire stump to stump so that the incoming Confederate troops were tripped up. In fact, it was probably the reason that Longstreet called a retreat, because he heard that from the front the troops couldn't get past it. That wasn't true. They could get past it. They were disorganized by it, but they got past it. But when Longstreet heard about it, he called the retreat after the 20 minutes of carnage on the morning of November 29th, 1863. Anyway, in town, in addition to Orlando Poe, who was an engineer, was a man named Orville Babcock. He was younger than Poe, and he had been working down south, down towards Lenore City and Loudon. He worked on a pontoon bridge that he was quite proud of, that had to be destroyed right after he finished it. And then he came back up in this direction. So he was in town when the siege began and when the battle happened. The images that were taken by Babcock, who Poe says is also on the train, has his own car full of equipment. At this point, photography techniques were such that you needed chemicals and you needed big heavy cameras and you needed a dark room. There was a lot of equipment that went along with coming to Knoxville for a photo shoot. So Barnard was taking care of the equipment, traveling with the equipment, and the images that the two men produced, Poe, Barnard, and in a little bit of Babcock, at least Babcock's in the picture. This was all documented and very carefully dated. And in Poe's diary, even the days where they were at various locations were dated. Anyway, as people became aware of this photo documentation of what happened here in Knoxville, Poe was getting requests from many of the engineers in the U.S. Army. And Barnard had 3 cameras with him. He had a stereo camera, one 12 by 15 size and the other 18 by 22. And there are some images of Knoxville, of the bridges actually at Straw Plains. It may be Barnard. There's some maybe. It might be another man named Cooley, but that's a whole other lecture. In any case, you can see this 3-legged camera that was used to do most of the work here. And it's interesting, too, that Barnard was being paid quite well for his technology and his service. His pay was equivalent to that of a colonel in the cavalry. So this man, who was a civilian, was being paid well by the Army and doing very, very good work for the Army. And Poe recognized his talents, recognized the advantage of documenting photographically, and brought him here to Knoxville to photograph Knoxville. This is a great image. It is Poe sitting, Babcock. This is Fort Sanders, Northwest Bastion, where the attack took place. You can see all the tree stumps. The telegraph wire was actually wrapped around and pulled tight so that men would trip over it. It was probably pure copper wire, but it might have been covered with gutta percha, which is a rubber product. It's hard to say. With the mud and the wet and all of that, it would have been fairly invisible, whether it was copper color or whether it was black, but it was a very effective deterrent. It didn't stop the troops, as I said, but it certainly did disorganize the ranks. This, as you can see, it says Barnard on the side, and it's part of a series. This is number 25, but this is showing Poe and Babcock on the field of battle. It was taken November 19th, approximately the 19th. No, I'm sorry, this one's the 21st. And it's dated, as you can see, and it's fascinating for us at the McClung Museum that the sword owned by Orville Babcock was donated to the McClung Museum in the 1970s. We know it's Babcock's sword because it's engraved with his name. It's engraved with the date. It's a presentation sword. It was given to him by his brother, and he owned it by the time, because of the presentation date, we know when he owned it. He went on to become the aide-de-camp of Grant after this assignment. He was with Grant through the rest of the war, and when Grant went to Appomattox, went to meet Robert E. Lee for the surrender, Babcock was there. In fact, Babcock was the officer that met Lee under the apple tree and brought him to the McLean House in Appomattox Courthouse. Appomattox Courthouse, for those who don't know, is the name of the town. And the actual signing of the ceasefire, the surrender, was done at the home of a man named McLean. And this, the meeting was, before the meeting began, Lee was met and escorted to that house by this man, Babcock. We tried to figure out through all of the paintings and the documentation, the written documentation, there were no photographs, there was no photographer at Appomattox Courthouse that day. All of the paintings show Babcock with a sword, but they're guessing. And so we really don't know whether or not Babcock had his sword with him, but if he did, it was probably the one that we have in our collection. Anyway, panoramic art. Knoxville was the beginning. Not that it hadn't been done before, but I haven't been able to find any other Civil War location, east or west, where there's a 7-frame format, 360 degrees of the whole town. The location for the primary panoramic view was the top of the tower, which is where Ayers Hall is now, at the top of the hill on the University of Tennessee campus. It was the college then, it was the East Tennessee University. It was in the same location where it is today. The camera was put up on the top of the buildings, and when you can see in the panorama, the chimneys appear in a couple of the pictures. But this is where the panorama, the 7 frames were taken, and they were also very clearly dated. All of these multiple images that were taken by Barnard that day, or that week, were published in the official military atlas of the Civil War that came out in 1891-95. Knoxville is beautifully represented by these photographic images in that large and very important publication atlas of the whole Civil War. The reason that Poe brought Barnard back was that he knew how well he had done. He was a man who was aware of his own talents, and he wanted to document the fortifications as they were built here in Knoxville. Knoxville is a natural fortress. It was easy to defend. It was work that Poe was rightly justified to be proud of, and Poe felt that the contribution of the engineers and volunteers and everyone who contributed to building the fortifications, that was key to the victory, or the fact that they could not be taken by the very best assault troops of the Confederacy. Now, at one point, Poe apologizes in a letter. He says the photographs are not as artistic as they might have been, because they were used to document that he wanted to document the defenses of Knoxville. I'm sure he recognizes that it could be more artistically posed or whatever he felt how they were lacking, but the detail and completeness of the work that Barnard did, I don't think any apologies are necessary. It's treasure trove for us 150 years later. The old photographic techniques mean if you get a very good copy, it's very dense. When you enlarge it, you don't just get big pixels. When you get a high resolution of the original, you get more and more detail. So you can see things like laundry on the lines. You can tell whether a window is open and closed. And I'll show you a place where there's a horse standing that you just don't see necessarily at the far distance, but if you enlarge it, pull it up, and you can see that the horse is standing in front of a house. In the early days, some of the notations looking at these photographs, they talk about using a microscope. And of course, before computers and our ability to enlarge and crop and cut and detail all of that, they used microscopes to get at the density of the information that was in the old prints. These images, if anybody's interested in looking at them, are all available at Library of Congress. They're downloadable, and it is fascinating to go ahead, download them, and enlarge details and see some of the information that's not readily apparent in the larger spectrum of photographs. Anyway, this is the first of the 4 images from the top of the cupola. That's the tower, which is the main building at present-day University of Tennessee. They're dated March 9th, 64. This is the Tennessee River, which was called the Holston at that time. This little house here, they called it the White House. It is the President of Tennessee's house. You can see there are cannon and artillery wagons here, and you can see too that it's red mud and no trees. This is the land. When I first saw this, I thought, oh dear, Knoxville was destroyed during the Civil War. That's not true. The city itself is between, this is Second Creek, and then you go over this plateau, which is downtown Knoxville, and then First Creek is kind of the end of town on the other side. But this is going around the town. Here on the crack is the Deaf and Dumb Asylum, which is now the Duncan Law School. There are tents over here. And then this is a White House, the White family. Hugh Lawson White would have been here. And then this is Kingston Pike with the rifle trenches going across Fort Sanders at the top of the hill. And over here, as I said, if you enlarge it, you can't really tell. There's a horse that's tied to a rail outside this house. Any one of these 4 frames can be taken separately, and with enlargements, you can find out a huge amount of information. The river itself is lower, way lower than it is now. You can see islands out there, and again, it's just got a huge amount of information. But what he was concerned with is the military fortifications. So you've got Fort Sanders and rifle trenches and military installation down here. This other 3 frames. This actually is that same White House where the president would live, UT president. So this connects. And then over here on this other side, it would connect to the 4th frame of the image that we just saw. University of Tennessee is all over here now. Right here, approximately, is where the McClung Museum is. And here you can see a chimney that was on the roof. If you look back at this image, of course, you can see chimneys, buildings in the other direction. So it's pretty clear where the photograph was taken. And as I said too, there's a huge amount of information that's in here. This is where Chapman Highway would go in future years. So this was Fort Dickerson, Fort Stanley, and over here you would find Fort Higley. The river, again, you can see the island showing was much more shallow before TVA, dredging, and that kind of work took place. And also, again, you can see it's treeless and it's pretty much torn up red dirt. These heavy wagons carrying cannon and ammunition are going to be metal rim wheels, and the whole of the road system is pretty much a mess. But in March, this is going to be wet, muddy, and stripped of vegetation. Now this is 4 frames, 1, 2, 3, 4, and it's taken from Fort Stanley on the south side of the river. Very interestingly, here you can see the camp, so you can see what the soldiers' living conditions were. Trees stripped of branches up as high as you can reach, and again, river at that time called the Holston. There's the town, and when you enlarge this, you can see University of Tennessee. You can see the fortifications behind. Here you can see fortifications on Fort Stanley. So this is, over here, Fort Dickerson. So this has quite an interesting amount of content of military installation in Knoxville. Now this one was taken near the Mabry Hazen House, just to the west of the Mabry Hazen House. And This is a road. This is a man sitting, and when you enlarge this, he's got a pipe sticking out of his mouth. This is the creek, first creek, basically, that was dammed and turned into a water barrier. When this picture was published in Gordon Seymour, Digby Gordon Seymour's book, it was reversed, because looking at it, they thought, oops, this is Tennessee River. Well, in fact, this is the pond that was created by Orlando Poe by damming First Creek. The town is over the hill. This is probably the Dandridge Road going up the hill towards Mabry Hazen House. And again, you can see the big trees. So many of the big trees are gone. This is another one that's fascinating. I have enlarged it, looked all over the ground to see if there's anything that you can possibly identify. It's pretty much there's no trash. There's nothing there that is identifiable, but you can look at the different houses here and just see more detail of what East Knoxville looked like at this time. Now, if you look at the three guys that I want to highlight here, Poe and Barnard. Poe was a professional soldier and an engineer, and he's working with a civilian professional. Poe and Sherman. Well, Sherman is, of course, the invading general, and he is the new commander in the West in the spring of '64. And he sees the work of this young, innovative engineer, and he says he wants Poe on his team. He gets Poe directly. He also recognizes the work that George Barnard has done here in Knoxville, and he requests that Barnard follow that comes along with the push towards the South. Poe does join Sherman's staff, and he receives regular promotion. He is in the photographs in Atlanta. He may even have taken some of the photographs of Sherman, but his role, he quickly becomes a trusted advisor of Sherman. Poe is the one who figures out corduroy roads, and not single-handedly, there are other engineers involved, but he is he's at the top, and especially pontoon bridges. It's a fascinating study in how to move pontoon bridges and lay pontoon bridges and pick them up again and move them to the next necessary location. And Poe is the man who is in charge of that. There's also something called the is it the Sherman necktie? Yeah, that's what it's called. And that's a way of destroying railroad tracks, heating the rails and bending them such that they are no longer usable. They can't be reinstalled. And that's something that was done under Poe's direction. And now Sherman and Barnard, this invading general, decides to document his campaign to the South. And based on the work that Barnard did in Knoxville, Sherman requests that Barnard come with him on that campaign across Georgia. So if you look at these three guys, Sherman's attitude was to hire the best men and delegate. Barnard, he does visual artistry, and yet he's recording historic facts. And Poe is a very good writer. He writes his official reports, he writes articles afterwards. He's very literate, and he has an eye on history. He photographs he himself is photographed many times, but he's also photographing his work, and he incorporates those photographs into his official reports. And this is quite new and exciting for the U.S. Army. Now, Sherman and Barnard, this is a whole new partnership. When Sherman actually got on the move and went through Georgia, it was too rapid for Barnard to actually take photographs immediately, but he was there. And he went back in 1866 and retraced the exact sorry about that. Badly spelled, R-O-U-T-E, and he photographed important locations. There's a letter in the Orlando Poe papers that is written by Barnard to Sherman, and he's saying to Sherman, what do you think? Should I do a photograph album? Would you support it? Sherman says, yes, indeed, it's a great idea. And so Barnard begins the work that is his lasting legacy, which is a photographic album of Sherman's march to the sea, getting to Savannah and Charleston. Some of those pictures are some of the most, some of the best pictures of the war. And the book was actually published in 1866. It was called Sherman's Campaign. He made 100 copies, and at this time, all the photographs had to be hand printed and actually affixed to pages in the album. The ability to reproduce photographs in large quantity to include in anything at this point. You couldn't do it for newspapers or for Harper's Weekly or any of those. They all had to go to lithograph, which is a copy of a photograph. So these beautiful albums were assembled, and they were purchased by generals and diplomats and people who had $100, which was a lot of money, to invest in this kind of publication. This is what it looks like. This is an original. It's leather bound, and it's Barnard's photographic views of the Sherman campaign. This is another version, a little bit pricier version. And this is the title page, Photographic Views of Sherman's Campaign, embracing scenes of the occupation of Knoxville, the great battles around Chattanooga and Lookout Mountain, the campaign of Atlanta, march to the sea, and the great raid through the Carolinas. So you can see that Barnard included pictures from prior to the Sherman campaign. And of course, we know he went down through Chattanooga on the train because we verified that with the diary of Orlando Poe, but also because these photographs exist and they show scenes of Chattanooga. But then he does go on the march to the sea and up into the Carolinas. So you can see that this is George Barnard, official photographer of the military division of the Mississippi. And here you can see the names of the different photographs. This is the order of them. In the beginning, there is this photograph of Sherman and his staff. And what I think is fascinating about this is you can see there all these guys there are very formally posed. They have to sit still while the photographic process does its thing. But later, this is the image. You notice there's a guy here who was not in this picture. When this picture was published in the album, this guy was inserted. And this is an early example of photoshopping, basically. He wasn't there. He was later imposed on the photograph. So teaches you to be a good consumer of historic photographs. That even in the earliest of photographs being published, it was possible to lead you to believe that this was a group image when in fact the guy in the chair was superimposed. Sherman and his generals. Now, this is a fairly famous picture of Sherman. He noted afterwards that his horse was a perfect gentleman and stood there motionless while this photograph was being created. This is in fortification in Atlanta, and similar setting. This is in Rebel Works in front of Atlanta, Georgia. This is wrecked. You can see axles from the trains, and the tracks are ripped up, and something's burned. This is Atlanta. This sky is almost certainly recreated. They did a lot of that. Barnard did. He put in more interesting cloud patterns in the sky, so sometimes you can look at different photographs and see the very same sky. Beautiful bridge at Whiteside. This was Union, a bridge that was created. Well, I better not say that. At any rate, this is a photograph by Barnard that is, and you can see for scale and size, they frequently put human figures into the pictures. This is a beautiful picture of the Capitol at Nashville being constructed. Again, the sky might have been artistically enhanced. Again, the sky is very interesting, may not have been in real life. You can see there are soldiers up here. Cannon down here, Nashville. Now this one is interesting because it shows you the photographic wagon, the camera, and the photographer. And this is the equipment that he would need to take all along the trail if he were going to take photographs at every single location. This is in Atlanta, and it has the soldiers sitting on what is an earthen fortification, looks like. Guns here. Now this particular print, Battlefield of New Hope Church in Georgia, very nice. But the reason I included it is here you can see the wagon and the horse of the photographer. And this one was probably taken in '66 when he went back and photographed important locations along the trail that he had ridden with Sherman and the Army. The critics about Barnard. Barnard's name has not forever been associated with the best of Civil War photography. People really didn't know his name, but one of the critics, Mrs. Keith Davis in 1980, said, the Chicago Historical Society has a number of impressive, unattributed two-plate panoramas of Knoxville that could be by Barnard. Well, looking through Poe's diary and the signed prints, yes, they are. And it says the existence of a two-plate panorama in Sherman's campaign, the evidence that some of Barnard's photographs were used in map making suggests that he may have made a large number of these panoramas. Well, in fact, he did. So in 1980, they weren't sure, and now we are. And then another quote, few, if any, of his contemporary had Barnard's technical expertise, artistic sophistication, pictorial originality, and broad network of professional contacts. His career provides a unique cross-section of the ideals, issues, and personalities of 19th century American photography. It is time George Barnard stepped at least partway out of the shadows of historical neglect. We have much to learn from him. So this is the man who photographed Knoxville, who documented Knoxville Civil War history. Now, as I said, it was a brand new chapter in military documentation. Few images were published in that atlas, the atlas that came out in 1891 through 95. The atlas was to accompany the huge work, which was the published records of the Civil War. And this is what the atlas looked like in 2 volumes. First edition has 175 double folio plates, 821 colored maps and charts, 106 tinted lithographs after original photographs, and 209 line drawings. It's a very impressive collection of information, documentation of the war. For instance, there's a photograph of Grant. On the right is the lithograph. This is what you had to do before there was the technology to actually reproduce photographs in printed publications. This is the size of the map and of the atlas. It's actually readily available now. It's been reprinted a number of times with various quality, but it's not hard to find a copy of it now for a reasonable price. Not an original. Original is going to be a very pricey item, but the reproductions are good and generally available. This is kind of what it looks like. You see here is the map of Knoxville. This is what, sadly, well, not sadly, but inconveniently, it's on the fold. So the fold of the book goes right down here, but this is what the map of Knoxville looks like. And in addition to Knoxville's interesting mapping, there is the map of Georgia. This is not a good copy, but it's also available online. It's Brevet Brigadier General O.M. Poe, and it is the map of the Army under the command of General Sherman in Georgia. So this shows that Poe went from here to the mapping of the Georgia campaign. Sherman actually did his own autobiography in 1891. This was just before his death. It's well written and has a lot of detail about all of the things that I've just talked about. And I'd just like to point out that the collaboration, cooperation among these three guys, Poe worked with Sherman for the rest of his life. He published extensively. He traveled the world, but he also Poe did lighthouses and locks on the Great Lakes. When Poe died in 1895, every ship on the Great Lakes flew their flags half-staff, half-mast. Anyway, they lowered their flags for 2 weeks because of their appreciation for Orlando Poe. Sherman continued to serve in the military, and Barnard published his monumental album. Much of his work, however, sadly for Barnard, was lost in the Chicago Fire of 1871. And it's because much of the original that was in his possession was destroyed, he kind of fell into obscurity, and his work was attributed to other people or not recognized as his own. So he, since the 1980s and 90s, has been coming back into notoriety. You look at the understanding and implementing of new techniques for information gathering and preservation. This collective contribution to historic documentation is a lasting legacy of excellence for these three outstanding men who were connected in Knoxville in 1864. The fact that these guys met here, that Sherman looked at the work done here and then made sure that the quality that he recognized and valued was then a part of his going forward campaign. I think that's very interesting for Knoxville, and it's an important point to make. That's the end of the slides for today. This is the second part of the lecture on Sherman that is being given as part of the McClung Museum of Natural History and Culture Civil War series of 2020. My name is Joan Markel, and I'm the Civil War Curator at the McClung Museum.